All right, everyone. My name is David Kearney. I'm the Vice President of the World Trade Center, or President-elect. So that means Dominic is my boss, and he keeps me very busy. Bobby Brannon would normally be here as the President of the World Trade Center. Bobby's out on a road show right now with Ochsner Healthcare, trying to raise some money. So that's good for economic development and certainly good for the Congressman's district, and we hope to hear good news from Bobby soon. He sent his wishes and apologizes for not being here. Quickly, I'd like to introduce the head table and then maybe have each of you briefly introduce yourself and what company you represent, and we can then leave the floor for Congressman Scalise to give his remarks, and we can do questions after. Again, thanks all of you for being here. It's important that our members attend, and we appreciate the time you take out of your day to be here. At the head table, we have Congressman Steve Scalise. We have CEO of the World Trade Center, Dominic Knoll. Chief Operating Officer, Port of New Orleans, Pat Galway. We have Raymond Farreau, Commissioner Secretary, Port of South Louisiana. Robbie Evans, President of Contech International, and also the Chairman of our International Business Committee here at the World Trade Center. And we have Ms. Bonnie Eads with AT&T, who's a World Trade Center corporate member, and we're glad to have all of you here. And then maybe if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Pam Ross, I'm with Congressman Steve Scalise's office.
Christy App, JW Allen Company.
I'm John LaBorde. I'm retired, obviously.
It's not obvious, John.
I used to be called Tidewater, and I was the founder, the chairman, the president, and the CEO for over 40 years. I'm still alive, and I think.
George Mall and Associates.
Roy Gonzalez with the Gulf States Maritime Association. Richard Sieg with Dinner Marine, we're a shipping company based in Louisville.
Sarah Branch, the Offshore Marine Service Association.
I'm Jim Adams with OPSA, Offshore Road Service Association.
Ivan Radovich with Novasis, the management consulting firm based in New Orleans. Work a long time with.
Would you guys introduce yourselves as well?
I'm Rob Wilbanks. I'm the Communications Manager for the World Trade Center.
I'm Jennifer Levin. I'm the Social Programs Manager for the World Trade Center.
I'm Sean Kayla, and I'm an intern at the World Trade Center.
Thank you. And now I'll briefly introduce Congressman Steve Scalise. He's first elected to Congress in a special election in May of 2008. Congressman Scalise was overwhelmingly reelected in November of 2008 and again in November of 2010 to continue serving Louisiana's 1st congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Scalise is known as a staunch conservative who advocates for the principles of fiscal discipline, lower taxes, comprehensive national energy policy, ethics reform, a strong national defense, and traditional family values. And as a part of that, is a member of the Energy Commerce Committee. And Congressman Scalise has emerged as one of the leaders in Congress for pushing a strong national energy policy, which is obviously important to us here in this region. In Congress, Congressman Scalise serves as a Deputy Republican Whip, and his many legislative accomplishments include Disaster Recovery Improvement Act, which reforms FEMA to eliminate log jams and speed up the disaster recovery process. Congressman Scalise continues to fight for fiscal responsibility and government accountability. He introduced an amendment to House Resolution 1 that would sunset many of the czar positions, the executive branch, has created and eliminate appropriations to fund these positions and their offices. This amendment was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. So with that said, we're honored to have you here today, and really look forward to your remarks. And then for those of you that have questions, if you'll please reserve those until the end. We'll have a question and answer session, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, David, and Dominic, and everyone here at the World Trade Center. It's an honor to be here. It's good to be back home. We go back Monday in session, but you know, as David kind of touched on, there are a lot of critical issues that we're facing, not only in Congress, but as a country. And I think, you know, as you look at the various things that were talked about, you know, in the short term, of course, getting our economy back on track, getting spending under control in Washington. Just last week, Standard & Poor's downgraded the bond rating of the United States of America. You know, we're in very, very delicate times right now, and a lot of very serious issues that I still don't think Congress and the White House are addressing adequately, and so there is a lot of work still that needs to be done. I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues specific to us here in Southeast Louisiana, especially as it relates to the port and our port system. And also in relation to the energy industry and some of the things that you know, John's really well aware of, and others have been battling all on the same front as it relates to energy policy. And then I'd like to kind of keep it open and just take any questions you've got and have an informal discussion about things that you know, that whether it's something you think we should be focusing on, or you know, why something's happening the way it should. There's not always logic involved in the things that you're seeing coming out of Washington, but at the same time, I do think there's a very large divide, not only in the country, but there's a big divide in Washington on how to address the issues and the challenges that our country are facing. So, you know, with that, I think, you know, initially when we're looking at what's happening with the port, you know, the most immediate issue we've been dealing with lately has been with the dredging of the port. The Mississippi River, the mouth of the Mississippi is, you know, right now we're at a high water level, but we all know that that's going to eventually lower back down. And then where are we in terms of a Corps of Engineers policy to properly dredge the Mississippi River so we can move commerce throughout our port? You know, just recently in the State of the Union address, the President actually talked about a goal of doubling exports from America. Now, that's a goal I strongly support. The paradox there is, how can you on one hand say that it's a goal of your administration to double exports, and at the same time you reduce the amount of money that you have in place to dredge the Mississippi River, where so much of that commerce will move through? We all know the history of the Mississippi River, and really the growth of our country is tied inextricably to the spot we're standing at right here. And the whole reason for the Louisiana Purchase was to gain access to the Port of New Orleans, to get the ability to move commerce through the Mississippi River from the Gulf of Mexico. And yet we're also at a point where the Corps of Engineers is pulling back on the resources that they're using to dredge the Mississippi River, and it's just causing real problems. You know, I've heard numbers that for every foot of reduction in draft that you lose over $680,000. It's a big issue. It's a big issue we're battling. Our entire delegation is in unison on this, and we've sent a letter to the President asking him to address it. We're doing some other things to try to reform the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, the way that fund is utilized. There's a lot of money in the fund, but it's not necessarily used in a way that the taxes that your industry pays and the fees that your industry pays are really designed for. And so we want to get better use of that fund and make it work better for the overall maintenance of our harbor system. So that's something else that we're working on. If you look at the issue of trade, and I'm a strong supporter of free trade, right now we've had a deadlock for a while now especially on 3 critical trade agreements. And if you look at both Colombia, South Korea, and Panama, there's been a deadlock on those agreements, and we finally have gotten a break in the deadlock, especially as it relates to South Korea. That one was kind of seemingly getting lost in the shuffle, but we were able to tie all three together and say, wait a minute, we've got to move forward, but we can't leave South Korea out. We need to move forward with Colombia and Panama. And we did just get an agreement from the White House to approve all three of those treaties. And it's our goal in the House. We're still waiting for the formal presentation of the legislation from the White House, and it's our understanding that they're putting the final language together. But the agreements have been reached, which is really good news. And it's the goal of the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp, who I serve with, to move legislation out of the House by July. So hopefully we get the legislation shortly from the White House, do the things that we've got to do to get it moved through, and by July have that moved through and hopefully have that legislation approved, which would mean billions of dollars of increased trade. And I would think that the Port of New Orleans is going to be an active player in that increased trade that we'll see, both imports and exports, with those three countries. So that's something that's, I think you're going to be seeing in the next few months come out of Congress that will be positive. There are a lot of things that you might see right now that aren't as positive. And, and I think the big frustration we are dealing with the most right now, especially as we were reflected last week on the one-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon explosion, is the outfall from that as it relates to policy from the Department of Interior and their push to not only create the moratorium, which actually went against the recommendations of the scientists and engineers that the president himself put together to do a 30-day safety report after the explosion to say, well, what happened and what are some things that we can do to improve safety? The president put a team of scientists together that came up with some really good recommendations. The problem was Carol Browner, his energy czar that he had in place, and by the way, that was one of the czars that I was able to eliminate with my amendment, and that was actually signed into law by the president just 2 weeks ago to eliminate that position. And she was the person who actually doctored up this report. Scientists said, wait a minute, we don't think it's a good idea to have a moratorium, and yet there was a report that supposedly was signed by them and peer-reviewed saying have a moratorium, and the scientists literally the next day all stood up, a majority of them, and said this is not what we said, first of all, and by the way, we also think it's a bad idea because it actually reduces safety in the Gulf, and they listed really good reasons. I spoke to a number of those scientists to find out exactly what their intention was with the recommendations they made, but also what their reasoning was behind why they thought the moratorium was a bad idea. And that actually makes a lot of sense, and unfortunately we've seen some of that. One of their big concerns was if you have a moratorium, your best and most experienced, most technologically advanced equipment and crew will leave. And guess what happened? In the last really 8 months, we've seen 6 now of the deepwater these big deepwater rigs leave the United States of America. And we've been tracking them. I share this with my colleagues because people from outside of South Louisiana, Texas, that aren't seeing this on a regular basis. I mean, it's not a story being covered by the national media, not only the moratorium, but now the permitorium where they're trickling. They've released a few permits, but there's no clear policy still. And when you talk to companies, and I'm sure some of you are dealing with this firsthand, you still, from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, don't have a clear path for getting a permit, for filing your drilling plan, to know what you need to do to comply with the law. And these are companies that didn't have anything to do with this disaster, had great safety records, played by the rules, want to go back to work drilling safely, and yet still can't do it. And so as we've tracked the rigs that have left, I really was perplexed a few months ago as we saw really a few weeks ago, as we saw what was happening in Egypt and the uprising in Egypt, in other countries in North Africa and the Middle East. But one of those deepwater rigs has left to go to Egypt. So you've got $1 billion asset, and you've got a major employer, almost 1,000 jobs tied to that one rig that's worth about $1 billion. And that employer is saying, I think it's better to do business today in Egypt than in the United States of America. When you think about that, And when I share it with other members of Congress from around the country, that's when it really hits home. You know, because they've never been to a rig, maybe. They don't really understand how energy is produced. And, you know, maybe there's still some people in Washington who think that gasoline comes from the gas pump. And that's where it emanates, you know, the tank in the ground there. And, you know, and when you talk to them about what the real process is and how the technology is so advanced now, and yes, we had a tragic, devastating disaster with the BP spill in the Deepwater Horizon. But when you talk about how isolated of an incident that was and how so many other companies are in deeper water than 5,000 feet and drilling safely and have a higher standard of safety already and want to go back to work, and they're not able to. We've lost over 13,000 jobs in South Louisiana directly related to the president's policy. And so when the president goes to Rio de Janeiro and said, my energy policy is to drill in Brazil, we're sitting here going, hold on, Mr. President, we want to drill here in America. We want those jobs to be here in America. We don't want those billions of dollars being sent to these other countries, not only Brazil or Colombia, but the Middle East. We could completely eliminate our dependence on Middle Eastern oil if we actually opened up the areas here in the United States of America where we have known reserves. And it's vast reserves. You know, of course, in natural gas, what we're finding is just unlimited, but in oil as well. And yet so much of this is shut off by the federal government. And we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs, and we're talking about billions of dollars. And when you talk about the national debt and the deficit we've got this year alone, a $1.6 trillion deficit this year, 42 cents of every single dollar the United States spends today is borrowed money. 42 cents of every dollar. And that means that's more debt that's being dumped onto the backs of our children and grandchildren, as money is being borrowed from countries like China. And yet we could generate billions of dollars today in revenues to the federal government just by opening up some of these areas in America that are closed off. Not to mention the jobs you get. And in a tough economic time especially, we should be doing everything we can to create jobs. And we know where the jobs are right here. We know what we can do today here in South Louisiana to create thousands of jobs. Like I said, we've already lost 13,000. And that's the White House's numbers, by the way. I use those numbers because that's the most conservative estimate. I mean, even the White House is acknowledging their policies have cost us 13,000 jobs in the last year. We know it's a lot higher number. But, you know, rather than getting in an argument over whose numbers are right, I'll use their numbers because their numbers are bad enough. And you know, and so when you look at this, you know, and then you hear the president giving speeches about high gas prices. I mean, frankly, people are irate, as they should be, about the rising price of gasoline. We're not even in the summer yet. You know, typically in January, February, March, April, you're still seeing lower gas prices, and when they get higher, it's usually in the summer. We're already seeing $3 and now $4 a gallon gasoline, and we're in April. And so people know it's going to get worse. And you know, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because we've got an administration that said we don't want to explore for energy in America. Well, gee whiz, what is that going to do to gas prices? Is that going to lower them? Of course not. Our demand hasn't dropped. Our demand's actually growing. You know, we could talk about renewable energy all day. I'm all for it. You know, whatever we can do on wind and solar, let's max out. Anybody who's honest with you is going to tell you you can't get to 20% of your household electricity grid if you maxed out on wind and solar. And by the way, to do that, the billions of dollars it would cost, the time it would take to build that infrastructure, it might take you 20 years to get to that point where you're maxing out, where you're providing 20% of your household electricity. Doesn't even touch transportation fuels. You know, and let's do it. Let's explore and innovate and develop those technologies. But you got to be honest with people. In the meantime, we're still going to need fossil fuels in this country. And we've got them here in America. We don't need to bring them in from the Middle East, sending them billions more dollars, increasing not only our trade deficit. You want to talk about a big driver of trade deficit in America? The amount of money we spend to send to foreign countries to purchase energy when we've got it right here and it's shut off by the federal government policies. And so, you know, when you look at all of this, the rhetoric just doesn't match up with the policies. And we're pointing that out. You know, I tell people, we put a chart together a few weeks ago that shows the price of gasoline when President Obama took the oath of office. It's $1.83 a gallon. And these are real impacts that these policies have on people. You know, and maybe somebody in Kansas a few months ago didn't really understand the impact of the permatorium here in South Louisiana because They're not seeing on the nightly news about the 13,000 people who lost their job. It's just not reported, unfortunately, by the media. They won't cover it. But when they're paying $4 a gallon and they're paying maybe $80 to fill up their SUV, all of a sudden now it hits home in Kansas or Wyoming or anywhere else. And so people around the country are going, wait a minute, why are gas prices going up so high, especially in advance of the summer, in advance of the normal time? And then they look at the policies, and they're rightfully angered by it. You know, and the president's running around talking about speculators and oil companies getting all these tax breaks. You know what he fails to mention? I've never heard the president even talk about this. It's a fact, and I continue to put it on the table every time I get the opportunity. The number 2 source of revenue to the federal government, next to the IRS, everybody who cuts their checks to the IRS every April 15th, and I'm sure feels patriotic when they do it, as some people in the White House talk about. But second to the IRS, the largest contributor of money to the federal government is the oil and gas industry. Number 2 contributor. Now, if you listen to the folks, you know, the president and others that are running around, you would think that, you know, they're getting so many tax breaks, they don't pay any money. Wait a minute. You might think I'm talking about GE. GE didn't pay any taxes, and by the way, the head of the president's economic advisor group is the head of GE. And he doesn't talk about them actually paying taxes because they don't pay any taxes. But the number 2 source of revenue to the federal government is the oil and gas industry. You don't hear anybody talking about that, but it's a fact. You go ask the IRS, you go ask the Federal Treasury where they get their money from. Next to the IRS, number 2 is the Department of Interior because of royalties, bonus bids, taxes paid by oil and gas companies. It's a fact. So we're going to continue to put the facts out on the table. We're going to continue to fight to have a sound energy policy in this country, an actual strategy that allows us to become energy independent, but also to create thousands more jobs, to generate billions more dollars to the federal government. And by the way, ultimately, we'll get the federal revenue, and I'm going to be filing a bill again next week, similar to a bill I'd filed last year called the Gas Act, Grow American Supply. Not only does it open up these areas that I've talked about that are closed by federal policy, where we can't even explore for energy in America, it opens those areas up, but it incentivizes the states that want to participate. You know, there are states like California that say, we don't want to participate, we don't want to contribute anything to America's energy supply, but we want to share the royalties. They don't mind spending the money that's generated by development in the Gulf of Mexico. But if they don't want to do it themselves, that should be their prerogative. But they shouldn't be able to share the revenues. But those states that do want to contribute, not only like Louisiana, but Virginia. Virginia now wants to go into the Outer Continental Shelf and go and explore, and they're going to find, I'm sure, billions of barrels of reserves. And if they want to go and do that and help this country become energy independent, they ought to participate in the revenues just like we ought to participate, and we're still not to this day. And that means billions of dollars to Louisiana for coastal restoration. So it's critical for so many reasons, not only for jobs, not only for American energy security, but also for coastal restoration in our state. You know, what other states want to do with it, what's most important to their needs in their individual communities, that should be up to them. We know what it is in our community. We just want that opportunity. We just want to go back to work. And so we're going to keep fighting for that. And so, you know, just wanted to kind of hit on a few of the different topics of what is happening in Washington, what we're fighting for, but what our challenges are, what our obstacles are. It's not like everybody agrees up there, you know, and maybe if they think their approach is right, you know, I don't think, you know, you're paying $4 a gallon because we've got a good policy. I think it's the policies that are getting us there. And so we've got to, you know, we've got to have an honest discussion about this. You know, all this rhetoric and finger pointing, and every time somebody gives a speech, they got to, you know, go and try to deflect and, you know, get somebody focused on something that's irrelevant to the discussion. You know, we ought to be talking about facts. We ought to be honest with people and talk about not only what the challenges are, but how we're really going to solve these problems and get our country back to being that land of great opportunity where the next generation has the same opportunities or better than the one that came before. And that's been the history of our country. I mean, from day one, from when George Washington took the oath of office, every single generation in America has had better opportunities than the one that came before. I mean, how many of y'all would agree with that? Imagine everybody. How many of you today think, under the policies that we're facing, that our children, my 4- and 2-year-old, our next generation is going to have the same or better opportunities than we have today if we keep doing this? Now, I think we know what's at stake. I mean, this is serious, serious business. When respected investment agencies are downgrading the United States' bond rating, we're at a very critical moment. in our country's future. And so we've got to fight these issues. We've got to battle this. We can't just sit back and let the status quo continue on. So that's what's at stake. I don't mean to give you such an uplifting speech, but I want to at least let you know what we're focused on, and I want to hear your questions and have a good conversation about the things that y'all would like to see us do.
What can we do as individuals?
As individuals, obviously, as people that are out there. Yeah, and I mean, I first want to thank those of you who are out there and continuing to fight on in the private sector, even with all these challenges. It seems like every federal agency has got a bullseye on capitalism. You look at the EPA and what they're doing, trying to regulate manufacturing in America out of business. I mean, literally, we killed cap and trade in Congress. It was a bipartisan vote, by the way, that defeated cap and trade, this national energy tax. Yet you've got a federal agency, the EPA, who's trying to, through de facto regulations, many of which I think they don't even have the authority to implement, trying to impose a cap and trade type of regime that would shut down manufacturing in America. They're still going forward with it. You've got, it seems like agency after agency that's just continuing to make it harder to do business in America. That's not the way it should be. And there are too many examples of that. The FCC just came out with a ruling that we're trying to block in Congress to impose net neutrality, which means basically the government starting to regulate the internet. We had a hearing on this in our committee, and look, I'm a computer science major. Some of the greatest innovations in our country have come probably in the last 20 years in the technology sector. You see all the things that you can do today with the internet you couldn't even do 2 years ago. And the broadband that's been built out, your capabilities on a cell phone today are much more than one of those box computers that took up an entire room like this. You can do more than that now, more power, because of the broadband capabilities that have been built out. And by the way, that was built out with private money. Over $500 billion of private sector money built that broadband out. It was built because there was basically a business model everybody had that said, if I build it and more people want to use these services, and basically it's a free market system out there. And the fact that government hadn't figured out how to regulate it, I think, is one of the reasons it's been so successful. Well, here comes the federal government saying, you know what, it's worked so well that we're going to come in and fix it. I mean, is that a scary thought? The federal government regulating the internet, because gee whiz, of all things that we need to figure out how to stop is the growth in technology. And so that's literally what they're trying to do with net neutrality, and we're trying to block that too. I mean, how many different places do you have to look to see the federal government trying to get in and stifle innovation, stifling the things that have worked so great in our country? And anybody who wants to compare the two and say, let's compare the track record of the federal government at running things, and then compare what's happened in the technology industry, especially as it relates to broadband and some of those innovations, who would you rather continuing to run it? Would you rather the federal government to come in and take over and change the rules, or would you rather to keep the rules as they've been, which means the federal government doesn't regulate it? And so these are the kind of things we're battling every day.
When the new coalition government came in Great Britain last year, one of the first things that the new prime minister said was, it's going to be tough, and we need to accept that it's going to be tough. I haven't heard any commentary coming out of Washington where people have said, we're going to have to face hard times as the economy gets back on track. And instead, it just seems like more like spending and deficits on top of deficits. What can we do to help get the message, that we need to pull that spending back in this country as well?
Well, and continue, George kind of talked about what can I do. I mean, in addition to continue to going out there and fighting the battles on the front lines and creating jobs and doing the things that you do to risk capital and, and still try to innovate. Contact not only those of us in Congress, the Senate, contact the White House. There's a number. We give out, I do these teletown hall meetings where you can get literally a couple thousand people on the telephone at any given time. I give out the White House's phone number. Because if you agree with me, well, Steve, I agree with you. I mean, telling you doesn't really do me anything because you already agree. So, well, you know what? The president's actually the one implementing all of these radical policies that are doing all these things that I think are destroying opportunities for not only future generations, but our current generation. And if you agree with me and you don't like the things you're seeing coming out of this administration, contact the White House. And so we give that number out. We'd be happy to get you the number because they ought to be hearing from everybody, not just the people that support what they're doing. They ought to hear from real people who are out there working and struggling through these policies. You know, gee whiz, every day when we talk about policies, don't get me into the health care bill. You know, but I mean, clearly, I mean, that bill went through our committee too. We had hearings for weeks on it. I mean, every single hearing we had, the bill changed hundreds of pages worth to where the final version's over 2,500 pages, and then it took them another 2,000 pages to fix it, to reconcile it, and nobody can still tell you how it really works. I mean, I talk to businesses every day, small businesses, medium, big-sized businesses, you know, and the one thing they know that they agree on is from what they can understand, it's bad. It's really bad. They just don't know how bad because all the rules and regs haven't even been written yet, but the ones that have been are making it harder for them to provide good health care to their employees, the ones that do. I mean, the whole idea of this thing was supposed to be to lower costs, to fix real problems, which there are, but at the same time, you should recognize that with all of that, you know, you talk about England, you talk about these other countries that have already done this kind of socialized medicine, whether you want to call it a single payer. This bill absolutely gets you to a single payer system, even though it's not spelled out in the law. And you're already seeing that. I mean, major consolidations already occurring in the insurance industry. Less competition is there now just a year later, and it hasn't even taken effect. Hundreds of companies have already asked for and received waivers from the White House. We had a hearing on this. You want to talk about an interesting hearing? I got a list. I said, I want to see the list of all the companies. You know, you heard about a few famous ones. McDonald's said, look, we can't even comply with this new law. We're going to need a waiver from the healthcare law. Otherwise, we're going to have to drop all of our employees. McDonald's, they're everywhere. You go down any street and you're going to find a McDonald's somewhere. They needed a waiver from the White House or else they would have had to drop their healthcare coverage for their employees. Well, guess what happened? They got it. So when I go around and ask them, how many of y'all in this room have gotten a waiver from the White House on the healthcare law? Anybody raise your hand if you got it? I mean, I've yet to find a real small business in Louisiana who got the waiver. So I got the list. I said, give me the list of all the people who got the waiver. And it's about 1,000 companies. I mean, it's a huge list. I found about half of the entities were organized labor unions. The same very labor unions who were in Washington last year saying you got to pass this bill because it's going to answer all these problems. You need to pass this thing. Well, they quietly went over to the White House and said, oh, and by the way, give me a waiver from it. Now, Anthony Weiner, a good friend of mine, colleague of mine from New York, sits on my committee with me, probably the most vocal advocate for the health care law. You know what Anthony's saying right now? We want to get a waiver for the city of New York from this law. You know, it reminds me of the amendment we put up in committee when the bill was going through. You know, you had all these members of Congress talking about how great this thing was going to be. Nobody could explain it. Nobody would give you a bill for more than 2 days that was the same bill where you could actually read it and understand it, but they were telling you how great it was. So we had an amendment we brought up in committee that said, okay, if it's so great, I don't think it is, but if it's so great, then every member of Congress has to join that plan. Guess what happened? Every single person who voted for the bill voted to kill our amendment. Every single one of them voted to exempt themselves from it. We got the record roll call vote. I would bring it to our town hall meetings when we were having town hall meetings on this a year and a half ago, and people, you know, oh, it's going to be good, it's going to do this, and I say, here's the vote. This is the vote of all the people who voted for the bill. Here's the vote we had that said, okay, every member of Congress has to join the plan that this creates. Every single person who voted for the bill voted against joining it. You know, does that tell you anything? You know, and so we got the list, you go through it, I mean, tremendous hypocrisy. But what's more interesting to me is not who got the waiver, because frankly, I want everybody to get the waiver. I voted for a bill to repeal this whole thing, so everybody gets a waiver from this thing. But I asked them for a list. I want to know all the people who got rejected from the waiver. You know what the White House has told me? We can't give you that list. Now that's the interesting list I want to see. And so we're going to keep pressing in our committee. I'm on the Oversight Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, and that's where we had this hearing about the waivers. You know, so I mean, you can go on and on about this kind of stuff, but this is real stuff. I mean, this is real. You can go get the list. I'll get you the list of companies who have asked for and gotten a waiver from the White House. You got to go get it from the White House. You can't just go get one. They don't just hand them out. But there are companies that are rejected. They won't tell us how many have been rejected. They won't tell us who the companies are that have been rejected. But I've yet to find one small business in South Louisiana who got the waiver.
Why don't you offer a bill that whoever is issuing the waivers, Department of Health or whatever, must grant the waiver to anyone who applies?
Yeah, and not only do I want it to be granted to everybody who applies, but I want it to be granted for the entire text of the bill. not just a single component, not just, you know what I mean? But it shows you just how hypocritical this stuff is, how bad this policy really is. That you've had 1,000 companies, from large to you know, labor unions, to cities, to states, that have asked for a waiver. And, you know, and especially when so many of the groups that got the waiver were the same groups a year ago who were saying, you need to pass this thing because it's going to be so good. And now they quietly went over to the White House and got a special waiver so it wouldn't have to apply to them.
Steve, I have a couple of comments and questions. One, recently, the president went down to Brazil on a vacation. While there, the media reports that he made a commitment to Petrobras for $2 billion in order to develop their offshore area. That was strange to me. I don't know, I've never seen much more on it, but you probably know whether that's authentic or not. But coincidentally, George Soros, one of his big supporters, owns a piece of Petrobras. And that seemed to connect. But more importantly, just a few days ago, the land management group here awarded a permit in the Gulf of Mexico to Petrobras, who owns a lease out there, to put the first tanker producing vessel out there. They've denied that for everybody else over the years, but just now that's been approved, and it's a big thing because, you know, it's the first thing for the industry. Am I correct on that?
Yes, sir.
So that's what's going on there. I'm not quite sure, but the American companies have been applying for those kind of permits for years and have been consistently turned down. The other thing is, there's a bogus issue that Nancy Pelosi and Salazar have been promoting on why do we have all of these idle leases in the Gulf of Mexico. That's almost an insult to them because it's a very tangible evidence of lack of total understanding of the oil and gas industry and how it works offshore. That's a long story on why a lot of leases out there appear to be idle and not being built. One is they can't get permits, but the other is in the overall cycle of developing an oil field. It starts long before those leases have been awarded, and a lot of money has to be spent along the way. And the fact is that every lease sold offshore is not going to be a producing lease. There's nothing guaranteed in the oil and gas business about drilling productive wells. They have some techniques that improve the possibilities, but there's never a guarantee when a drill stem goes down that it's going to be productive or pay for itself. I don't know how. There have been several articles. One was recently in the Wall Street Journal where the CEO of Chevron explained this process on the leases. If anybody is interested, it's a few days ago. It was a Sunday edition last weekend. Very comprehensive article. But that shows you, it scares the hell out of the oil industry people because it shows you there's no remote understanding of the business.
Yeah, no, you see.
Here we are on a global basis, a lack of oil and gas or a diminution in volume is a crisis for the world. Now, why that's not understood by the president, I can't understand. But the least we could be doing is trying to gain some degree of independence in this country by drilling on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and Alaska. I can't explain why that's so complicated, because as you just said, with all of the alternatives, the propellers, hot water programs, that won't come close to meeting the needs and continuing the standard of living that we enjoy here in this country, nor in other countries. So it's a real dilemma, but I'm glad to see you so active, and I'm very impressed by the fact that Congressman Landry seems to be right in the middle of it. He doesn't back down, apparently.
No, we've had a lot of fun working together. He, of course, represents a lot of that area right now along the Gulf Coast, and and he's jumped in with both feet to this battle as well. And when you look at it, it's frustrating because there are so many people that are making policy in Washington who don't seem to have any shame about expressing their ignorance on this issue every time they talk, because when you listen to the speeches, their policies completely contradict what they're saying publicly, and it shows, number one, they don't understand it, but they also want to demagogue it. They want to kind of play the least common denominator. I mean, everybody would love to think that you can just plug your car into a tree and get all the energy you need, or you put a little panel on the roof and it's going to meet all of your needs. I mean, I've yet to see them retrofit Air Force One with propellers and solar panels. They're still using fossil fuels to run that, and so I mean, you ought to have an honest conversation. If you're going to get into this debate, I want to see us have a comprehensive energy strategy in this country, and we don't have one. But you can. I mean, there's an ability to do it. I think it takes all of the above. I think, you shouldn't try to pit one energy source against another, because frankly, the demand for energy continues to rise. So even if you shifted over everything today to some other magical source of revenue, or a source of energy that doesn't exist, and again, they mislead people about what really is out there on alternatives. I mean, the alternatives just don't do it today. Hopefully they will. But in the meantime, we're shutting off so many of these areas. You talk about the use it or lose it provisions in leases. You know what I mean? Right here in the Gulf of Mexico, we had a hearing on this recently, and I asked some of the energy companies. I said, when you look at what happened with the moratorium and now the permatorium, I mean, so many people that were exploring that had to stop. They were told to shut down, which, by the way, is one of the more dangerous portions of your process. They were forced to shut down, and they still haven't been allowed to go back to work, exercising that lease that, by the way, they paid millions of dollars to get. And if you're doing your due diligence, which, as you said, it takes years, you've got to do your seismic exploration. You're going to do so many things before you actually go and start drilling, because you want to make sure that if you're going to make that multi-million, in some cases billion-dollar investment, you're going to make it based on an understanding, strong knowledge that there are oil sources there that you can go and get. But in the meantime, that takes time in and of itself. But right now, the federal government has told you can't even go and do that due diligence. But by the way, the clock's running. And I equate it like this. When they talk about these use it or lose it provisions, right now, all of the companies in the Gulf of Mexico that are on hold because of this permatorium, their lease provisions, the use it or lose it provisions, are still running. And so you could be in jeopardy of losing your lease, and you're not even allowed under law to exercise it, which I think we ought to extend. In legislation I support, we actually extend that and say, as long as the government's shutting you down, not letting you exercise the terms of your lease, then the clock ought to stop running. And I equate it to in basketball. We're going to watch the Hornets hopefully win tomorrow night. But if the Hornets are down by a point and there's 10 seconds left, and the referee's holding the ball, and they're running the clock, I don't think anybody would think that's fair policy. If the referee's holding the ball and the clock's still running, Chris Paul's saying, just give me the ball, give me a shot at scoring, nobody would think that makes any sense. I mean, if the referee's going to hold the ball and not let you play, the clock ought to be stopped. And right now, the federal government's saying, we're not letting you play by the rules of your own lease, yet we're still running the clock. And then Nancy Pelosi and the president are going to go out and give a speech and saying those oil companies they're sitting on all these known oil reserves, and they're not even drilling. Well, they're not drilling because he won't let them. He forgets to mention that in the sentence. But I mean, are they really, if they know that there's billions of barrels of oil out there, and they're paying millions of dollars just for the right to go and try to find it, and by the way, at over $100 a barrel, I would think they'd want to be going and getting it. Are you really, honestly, trying to convince people that they're just sitting on that because they just want to waste their money? This is ludicrous policy. It's ludicrous. We had some of the Shell oil from, talking about some of the problems they're having out in Alaska with those known reserves out there. I've been to Prudhoe Bay, and looked at the problems. The pipeline, the Alaskan pipeline, which is a major American asset, it is literally within months, if not a year, from shutting down because it doesn't have enough flow through right now. Doesn't have enough volume. And if you just, it isn't one of those deals where, if you just turn it off for a couple of months and then you crank it back up again, the oil will get so thick that you won't even be able to get anything through there. You're going to lose that asset. And here's the federal government saying you can't go explore in these areas, or your use it or lose it provisions are still ticking, while all these environmental groups are filing lawsuit after lawsuit to stop you from even being able to exercise your lease. That's going on out there in Alaska right now. The federal government's doing nothing to help them. One of the things I've looked at is we ought to put in place a fast track for some of these radical lawsuits. I mean, there are environmental groups who file lawsuit after lawsuit on any kind of energy exploration, and they've never even won one of the lawsuits, never won one of them. But it's a guarantee that it'll take you an extra maybe year to 2 years just to get through that first lawsuit, and then they'll file another one the next day. We ought to have a fast track. If there's somebody wants to go in there, first of all, it should be lose or pay. If you want to go and literally cost a company millions of dollars, filing what everybody knows is a frivolous lawsuit. No lawsuit of that kind's ever even been won before, but they have the right to continue to pop it on you and cost you millions of dollars, and possibly even lose your lease that you paid more millions of dollars for. There ought to be a penalty for that, and a fast track process so that at least you can have your day in court quickly so they can't shut you down. And this is what's going on out there in Alaska. This is crazy policy, and yet it's what's happening today. And oh, by the way, as gas approaches $5 a gallon, and the president tries to deflect from every other place, he's supporting these kind of actions. And American people get this. That's why they're trying to pick and find other boogeymen to try to change the subject.
Steve, there is a precedent on stopping the clock when the federal government has a moratorium. In 1969, when we had the Union Oil spill in the Santa Barbara Channel, Exxon had some leases there, and that went to the point where they, after 10 years of getting permits and starting construction on production facilities, they got a letter from Andrews, who was Secretary of the Interior at the time, notifying them that their 10 years expired, and they appealed that and did get an extension on that period.
Yeah, and then the Department of Interior has some jurisdiction there too, some flexibility. We've asked them to exercise it, and of course they won't. They just don't want to. They want those leases to expire, and again have another boogeyman to go and say, look, they're not even drilling, while they're not letting them drill.
To change the subject a little bit, Generalized System of Preferences GSP program expired January 1st. I don't know if you're...
What is that?
It's a trade preference program for underdeveloped countries to lower import duties on products coming into the United States from those countries. I was going to ask you what the status was, but I guess... Yeah,
I'm not familiar with that policy.
Steve, I wanted to, first of all, thank you that you came here today to us. I personally agree with most of the comments you made, or virtually all of them. I have a question regarding the deficit, because as you said, we have 3-point-something trillions. We have 2.4 trillions coming in, but they're short 1.6 trillions, I guess, this year. But I know Republicans, they try to cut it for 61 billions, and Democrats 33 billions. But once here we have 1.6 trillions there. So what can we do? What can we do to reduce that? Because that seems to be, as you already mentioned, at 43 cents a dollar, that seems to be a killer in the long run.
Yeah, we had this big battle over the short-term funding of government, and there was a potential government shutdown a few weeks ago, and it was averted at the last minute, literally at, we went and voted at midnight to prevent that from happening. But in the big scheme of things, that got resolved in a way that really doesn't even touch the deficit problem. It was a very small percentage of the deficit that got dropped. And to me, that was never the big battle. The big battle is over the budget for next year. And we just passed 2 weeks ago, and I didn't really get the opportunity to touch on it, so I'll touch on it now. 2 weeks ago, we passed a budget out of the House that really, it's not only the funding mechanism for next year starting October 1st, but it's also a 10-year forecast, and it sets caps in place on spending. It actually lowers baselines. One of the big problems is in the last 2 years, starting with the stimulus bill, the baseline of the federal government spending grew dramatically. At a time when most families are cutting back, every state has to cut back because they have balanced budget requirements, the federal government, in many cases, departments were growing by over 25%. federal agencies that grew by over 25%. And there were a number of them that did. And so the first thing we said was, you know, you got to roll those spending levels back, because if you just have a continuation budget today, that's a budget that's 25% larger than it was 2 years ago. And by the way, we're taking in less money in relation to what we were taking in before, and families are cutting back. Here's the government spending even more money. So even when the president says, okay, we'll have a freeze in spending. Well, a freeze in spending after you've raised your base level of spending by 25%, that's still a 25% increase. You know, so you want to freeze it at that? That's ridiculous. So what we said is, you know, you don't freeze it at the levels that are already inflated 25%, you roll those baselines back. And so we rolled in the budget that Paul Ryan authored. Paul Ryan's the chairman of the Budget Committee, congressman from Wisconsin, one of the most brilliant people you can hear talk. I mean, he understands the budget inside and out. I told him he needs to challenge the president to a debate on the budget, because the president's now, I've never seen this before. I mean, my minor was political science at LSU, and the president released his budget about a month ago, doubles the national debt in 5 years. You know, he gives a speech on fiscal responsibility, and then he releases his budget that doubles the national debt in 5 years. I'm still trying to reconcile those two speeches. And so doesn't even address long-term entitlements. You know, Medicare is going bankrupt. Everybody that looks at it will tell you, Medicare, if we do nothing, we just leave it alone, Medicare will go bankrupt. He doesn't even touch that, doesn't even address that problem, continues to allow spending to go uncontrolled for years down the road, doubling the debt. And so Paul Ryan comes out with his budget that we just passed 2 weeks ago that actually re-baselines based on pre-2000, pre-stimulus levels, so to take away those 25% increases, get government spending back to a level not that's controlled today, but that starts going downward in terms of spending, which means in a few years we actually get to a balanced budget. Doesn't even get you there next year, doesn't get you there in 5 years or even 10 years, but it does get us to a balanced budget, and it's got real reforms to strengthen Medicare, to solve some of the problems that would force Medicare to go bankrupt, solves that completely, and ultimately pays down the national debt, completely pays it down. It takes like 50 years to pay it down. That's how big the problem is. Now, you would think the president would go, hey, that actually makes a lot of sense, let's talk about it. He demagogued it. Comes out the next day criticizing our budget, saying it's irresponsible, it's reckless, it's, you know, draconian cuts and all this stuff. Doesn't even balance for maybe 20 years. Now, if you think that's draconian, my goodness, I mean, you try spending money you don't have for 20 years and see if your bank, when you stop paying them and your car company doesn't possess your car, you know, well, it won't even be year 2 before they come by and take all of that away from you. You know, so I mean, this is a modest proposal. We had an amendment that I supported that actually sped up the time to balance the federal budget. We weren't able to pass that. But at least it's a plan that finally turns the ship around and says, okay, instead of spending money and growing spending at a rate that can't be controlled, we actually start bringing spending down every single year, and we solve the problems with Medicare and Medicaid, by the way. And so, you know, with Medicare, for example, you know, and they're trying to call it a voucher. It's not a voucher. But it actually does solve the problems that Medicare's facing today in an honest way. And one of the things we do is, first of all, we say anybody who's 55 and over, nothing changes. If you're on Medicare today, if you're 57 and you're planning to be on Medicare in a few years, nothing changes. But everybody knows if we do absolutely nothing, somebody who's 65 today, ultimately that plan's going to go bankrupt, and they're not even going to be able to use it if we sit back and do nothing. So what we say is for anybody under 55, we're actually going to strengthen the program so that it can sustain itself. And one of the things we do is we go to what's called premium support, which is basically a plan similar to what members of Congress get, what federal employees get. Now, if you think those are bad plans, those are actually sustainable plans. But they're much more market-based. They work much more like Medicare Advantage. Seniors understand what Medicare Advantage is. That's not a privatized system. That's not a voucher. It's actually a plan most seniors like, which, by the way, the president undid. The president basically gutted Medicare Advantage in his health care bill. And seniors who are on Medicare Advantage love the program. And it's getting ready to go away under the president's plan. So we reverse that. We say you get to keep Medicare Advantage if you have it. But for somebody who's, you know, maybe 45 today, like me, who doesn't think it's going to be there for me, if we just sit back and do nothing, it'll be bankrupt. We actually strengthen the program so it works in a way that is sustainable, and that actually works just like members of Congress have today. So all of that's in our budget. We passed that, sent it over to the Senate. We're still getting criticized today by the president and, you know, Harry Reid and Chucky Schumer and some of these other folks who are completely ignoring the problem. You know, and I mean, you know, there's only a certain amount of time where you can continue running around misleading people about what's really happening. People know. S&P comes out and says, we're downgrading the bond rating in the United States of America. That doesn't happen because they're passing really smart fiscal policy in Washington. I mean, there are serious problems, but we've actually put real serious solutions on the table, and we've got to start tackling them. Every single year you wait to address just the Medicare problem costs you about $1 trillion more. Every year you wait, because long term, 10 years, 20 years from now, it becomes exponential. If you don't control it today and start getting it back manageable. And we did the same thing with Medicaid. Not the same thing. With Medicaid, a majority of the state's governors have said, look, Medicaid doesn't work. Any doctor will tell you. Ask a doctor if they take Medicaid anymore. It's a broken system, failed broken system, to the point where if you've got a Medicaid card, you can hardly even find a doctor that'll take it. But governors have been saying for years, look, we want to give us a block grant. We want to run this program. We can run it a whole lot better than the federal government. And frankly, I agree with them. Governor Jindal, as many other governors have said, just give us a block grant. We can spend less money and actually get better health outcomes. So we do that in our program. We actually convert Medicaid to a system that allows the governors to have the flexibility to run it the way, New York's healthcare system surely doesn't work the same way, or shouldn't work the same way as Louisiana's Medicaid system. Yet right now they're operating under the same set of rules, and if we want to do something a little bit more innovative, we've got to get permission from the federal government, and very often you can't get that. Well, they ought to get it. And by the way, you save billions of dollars by doing that, and you get better health outcomes. Now, why would you oppose that policy? Unless you want to control it all out of Washington and continue to be able to be the one to hand out the goodies and have people come to you and get permission to do it the right way. So, I mean, these are the debates that we're going to be having, and, and it's hard to have the honest debate because some people on the other side don't want to use real numbers, but we're going to call them out.
Congressman, I don't have a question. I just want to say on behalf of the port and the maritime industry, thanks for all you've done on the dredging issue and all that you will do in the future, because we're going to have a very difficult high water mark here in May, and so it's not going away. And thank you for, last time we were in this room with Congressman Micah,
yeah,
which was very good, and your energy and your enthusiasm was great. It gets us energized, and we appreciate everything you've done.
Well, thanks. I mean, I joke about the the depressing nature of some of these facts that we're talking about, but I mean, we're the greatest country in the history of the world, and I still think to this day we still are. But I also know if we sit back and let the continued policies go on like they are right now, that will not be the case. I strongly believe that. Just looking at what's happening, go look at Greece, but go look at countries like Argentina 100 years ago. I mean, just because you're great today doesn't mean you're going to be great 20 years from now. And, and they always say, if you don't learn from the mistakes of history, you're doomed to repeat it. In countries that have fallen, great countries that have fallen, have made the exact mistakes we're making right now. And if we continue to keep making them, shame on us if we sit back and do nothing in 20 years from now. Our kids have a lower standard of living because we were just happy with where we were and we didn't think anything could ever change, because it can. And so this is worth fighting for. And it's it's one of those critical times where if we don't put the flag down now and say we are fighting for this, for what's great about it today, so that it can continue to be great tomorrow. Because if we sit back and do nothing, it won't. So, I enjoy the fight. I hope we win the fight. I think it's very important that we win the fight, but it is a big fight.
I just want to echo what Pat said on behalf of the maritime industry for your energy and your passion to make sure that the Corps gets the proper funding that they're going to need. I'm not going to go over the facts that have already been said, but it's critical, as we all know. Thank you.
Thanks.
What, really up until probably within the last 6 months, free trade agreements are the ones that are pending weren't even really spoken about, and now that they are being spoken about, just with you being in Washington, what do you see for the trade agreements that are pending? What are their, I guess, possibilities of being passed, and which ones do you see being passed first?
I think South Korea, Panama, and Colombia will all be passed. And hopefully by the middle of this year, if not by the end of this year. There were a few impasses. There were a few points in the last few months where a few could have fallen by the wayside and were fallen by the wayside. And one of the things that we had worked on in the House was we said, look, I mean, we could pass, let's say, Colombia and just roll it through, but South Korea may just fall by the wayside because there were some that didn't want that to go through. And we said, no, we're not just going to piecemeal it and leave real opportunities on the table. It's got to be a package deal. And ultimately, we were able to get an agreement to do all three. So I think we're at a point now that they have been agreed to. A month ago, that was still in jeopardy. but that's been resolved. And so now it's literally at a point where they're just kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, which, you know, no guarantee, but at least I think we're at a point where I feel very confident that by July of this year, you will see the House passing those agreements that the President has formally sent down.
With the recent report by the IMF saying that the Chinese government GDP will pass the U.S. government size in 5 years, what pressure, if any, is Washington willing to put on the Chinese so that they will be able to evaluate their currency a little bit more? Or if any at all, what do you know about that?
And I mean, it'd probably be faster than 5 years at the rate it's going. But I mean, it's a real issue. And, you know, we all know they've been manipulating their currency. And some people kind of have looked the other way about that. Ultimately, there are a number of things I think we need to do in relation to Chinese trade and agreements that both our Commerce Department and our State Department need to be much more aggressive on. You know, to me, one of the biggest threats in our relationship with China is that it's one-sided in that if you look at all of the lost opportunity in American business, especially as it relates to intellectual property, China is the biggest thief in terms of stealing our intellectual property. You look at so many industries, the technology industry, where so many innovations come, the film industry. The largest loss of revenue to the film industry is piracy from China. We know this is happening, and they as a government sanction it, where they're literally stealing our content. You're talking about billions and billions of dollars of lost revenue to American companies. You're talking about billions and billions of dollars of trade gap to China, and they know it's happening, and we know it's happening, and we're not doing anything serious about it. You know, they might sit around at a table and, that piracy, nothing's happening on it. Our State Department needs to be much more aggressive in addressing those issues because, again, you get back to free trade, the biggest issue there is fair trade. Is it fair? And it's not fair, especially as it relates to intellectual property theft. It's a real problem. We know it happens. We know who's doing it. And yet, there's no real policy or plan in place by the government to stop it from happening. And we're talking about big jobs, billions of dollars in revenue to this country that we're losing every year.
The Disaster Recovery Act, how quickly are some of those changes happening, and what are some improvements that have already happened?
We're continuing to work with FEMA. There are a number of, and unfortunately we're now well over 5 years out of the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, and yet we haven't gotten in place enough real formal changes and reforms to FEMA policy, to Stafford Act policy. And so I think it's something we've got to continue working with them on. I mean, government works slow, but, gee whiz, we learn so many things about what's wrong with how disaster recovery happens. And, we were the guinea pigs for that. But, we ought to be able to take those experiences and use it to help other states. Hopefully we never have to go through that again, but we know somebody is. We may as well. Those same rules shouldn't be in place. And so, we're going to continue. I mean, a lot of these are things that can save money dramatically. I mean, I've been pushing to have pre-bidding in place, for local communities to encourage them to pre-bid disaster cleanup, for example. A huge expense. Federal government usually picks up 100% of that after a storm, and yet, if you just sit back and wait until the storm hits and then go and try to find the lowest bidder, there ain't no low bids at that point. And so the federal government pays 100% of that. I mean, you're losing billions of dollars if you pre-bid it in advance, but what you've got to do is where there's a cost share, you need to lower the cost share and incentivize local governments to pre-bid it today while you're in a more normal environment so that you're not reacting in a crisis where you've got a plan in place with a fixed rate in place to get that debris cleaned up. That's just one example where you could save billions of dollars, but FEMA doesn't want to give a discount to a local community to do that. And we know it, and we can show them how it will save them billions of dollars, but we're not going to give them a 5% discount to go pre-bid, so I mean, there's no incentive for them. So if they sit back and just don't do it, because it takes time to put all of that in place, in communities here, we've done it because we know, but there's so many communities throughout the country that still haven't and won't do it. Because there's no incentive for them to do it, and yet FEMA will pay out under the Stafford Act billions more because they won't do that policy today. And so this is just one example of what we can do.
The study that we released by GNO Inc. regarding like this area, it would be like the opportunity, because we great having this experience to be actually, you know, in good shape to be providers that that would help, you know, like in the developing community should they have experience. And I think this would be possible growing the industry, you know, for the area.
How far away are you?
All right, well, thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you. Again, thanks on behalf of the World Trade Center. We really appreciate your remarks. One thing I'd like to reiterate is Dominic, our board, our support staff, many of whom are over here, would like to support you in your efforts. If there's any work we can do to help you or any of our members that need information on trade, information on the ports, and we can feed that through your office, you know, we're here to do that. So with that, thank you. And here's a gift from the World Trade Center.
I would have bet it's a tie.
Yeah.
I'll use this.
Thank you, everybody.